Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get started in just a moment. We're going to let folks and the technology catch up as you guys are entering the room. I see some friendly faces out there. Thanks for joining us on our Lean DEI webinar today. Welcome. I see folks coming in. We have so much to cover. We're going to go ahead and get started. First, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. And Lean DEI combines next-gen artificial intelligence with high-touch people development to deliver a right-sized solution for building an inclusive culture. And I want to introduce you to our management team and share with you our agenda for the day. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Anissa Avon, and I am the founder and CEO of Turnkey Coaching and Development Solutions. Turnkey was founded in 2004. We are a global learning service outsourcing provider, providing coaching, HR consulting, DEI consulting, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting, and training. We have over 1,000 experts in the USA. We are located in every major metropolitan area in the US and in key hubs globally. But the reason that matters most to us today is because this topic of cultivating an inclusive, diverse, and equitable culture is near and dear to me for personal reasons as well as business reasons. And we've been counseling so many of our clients and peers around the change in this space, around the disruption that's happening, around the difficult conversations and the tides of change, right? And so I reached out and started talking to Vivek, the CEO of Weave, and Swetha, the CEO of Org Analytics. And boy, we were so passionate about this topic. We just started imagining what was possible if we could support friends and clients in changing their approach and eliminating some of the things that aren't working. And so first I want Swetha, if you'll introduce yourself, and then Vivek will introduce himself, and let's get this party started here.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Anissa. So I'm Shweta Pai. As Anissa said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Org Analytics. Org Analytics has been in the diversity and inclusion technology space for about 5 years. We're a startup that's focused on measuring the unconscious biases and measuring the inclusion within large companies. So this is obviously that I'm very passionate about, so much so that I left my job in the financial services world to start this company. My background, I'm rooted in finance and strategy and really operations and lean manufacturing. I've been trained in that. And that's why it's something that I'm really excited to share with you guys and to really get feedback on. And we'd love to hear more from you about what you think about the framework that we've developed with Anissa and Vivek, because we're really looking to build a holistic solution and share those ideas with you. So let me turn that over to Vivek, and welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hey everyone, my name is Vivek. I'm the CEO of Weave. In a previous life, I was a consultant for Fortune 100 companies. My job was moving from company to company in different industries, different company sizes. And I started to see a trend, which was this growing disconnect between employees and leaders. For a multitude of reasons, changing technologies, faster paces of work, most recently, this huge shift to remote. And the question came up for us, how do we build strong employee-leader relationships regardless of where we are? And our focus at Weave is using AI and natural language processing to solve that question. And that aspect of what we do at Weave is what really ties together parts of the Lean DEI framework. And we're excited to tell you more about that later.
Beautiful. So I want to set the tone for something. While we will be sharing with you what we've put together with Lean DEI, we also want you to know that we want you to take something away from this webinar that matters to you. So do reach out, share your questions with us at the end. We will be attempting to answer your questions. But what we're going to talk about today. First, we're just going to talk a little bit about the DEI landscape and how things have changed. We're going to talk about the elephant in the room. And at this moment, I won't even tell you what that is, but I bet you already know what it is. Hint, hint, resistance. We're also going to talk about how do you build the right size solution? How do you take what's worked before and bring it forward, but bring it forward in the right sized of way? And that takes us to what we call our 3 dominant steps for an effective DEI program, diversity, equity, and inclusion program. The first is identifying your unconscious biases and your champions of change. The second is engaging your employees, even crowdsourcing solutions from them. And the final is solving. How do you create a right solution for people development in a way that fosters inclusion? So Vivek, start us off with, just set the tone here. What's going on in our environment and social disruption that's happening?
As we all know, the world is changing. Social disruption is happening, and our choices are to try and run and keep up, to get run over by it, or we can choose to actually drive that change. D&I have been C-level issues for years now, and at this point, everyone knows the stats. Inclusive organizations are more innovative, they have greater returns, lower turnover, they capture more market share, but still we see companies stumble in often very costly and in very public ways. Bon Appetit recently came public with a toxic culture of microaggressions. Facebook and Google have had Black employees speak out on racism. WeWork has had age discrimination lawsuits. Twitter, Nike, Goldman Sachs have had lawsuits from women in pursuit of the C-suite. And very famously, Starbucks has been in the news a couple times in the past few years. In 2018, a manager called the police on 2 Black customers. In response, Starbucks very publicly shut down all 8,000 stores to do trainings. But just 1 year later, they're back in the news for banning employees for wearing BLM attire. The lesson here is that they're being reactive. Despite taking the situation seriously and closing down all their stores and pouring in impressive resources into unconscious bias training, the culture itself is slow to change because that's not what their focus is. Which kind of begs the question. At this point, companies are aware of the benefits of being inclusive and diverse. They're well aware of the costs of not being so. So what's the gap? What are we missing today?
Thanks, Vivek. So when we look at D&I initiatives, and we've been in this market and we've been watching this landscape for a while, here are some key trends that we see around the D&I initiatives that currently exist. Now, this isn't everyone, but this is a lot of companies. As Vivek said, the companies that stumble along this path. They stumble because a lot of times it is reactive. It's like the Starbucks example that Vivek gave. They are just focused on that one maybe demographic that is in the news at the time, but it's not a holistic, it's not a strategy, it's something that is going to change the way that companies work or the way that the employees are working. It's also because it's so reactive, your management tends to make it about a centralized top-down approach because management can control it. So the thought is, oh, let me put that up here that I can control and create a D&I office or diversity office, but it doesn't actually have any kind of impact on the day-to-day realities that employees who are on the ground and who are impacted by these biases, by these cultural norms, their day-to-day realities are not addressed at all. It's also because it's reactive and hence it's also broad, generic. You're just looking for check the box to do some virtue signaling and just to say, hey, we've done something, we're investing in it, but there's no kind of details around it. It's just a general money being thrown just to say that you've done something. And what we often see is that because of all of these things, again, the people who are on the ground, and especially the leaders who are on the ground. Now, these are the people who can actually affect change, but they have no support. And on top of that, this is just something that is seen as a intangible kind of feel-good program. So there's no real way to measure it, measure the impact, measure the return, and you measure what matters, right? So this is something that just falls off the wayside because you can't really measure the ROI. So you just kind of keep going along with these reactive measures until the next issue comes along, and then you throw more money at it. at the end of the day, there's just no long-term impact. On top of that, what we also see is that not all discrimination is obvious, right? So we want to make sure that we address that a lot of these norms, these biases are very much below the surface. So in order to move that massive ship that most large companies are, you can't just swerve and just say, okay, now I need to go left, let me just swerve over. You have to take incremental steps. And that's where all these initiatives and all these solutions, they won't be effective because they'll just focus on the swerving. So let me just turn it over to Anisa to talk about what we see in the programs at that deeper level.
Thank you so much. As Shweta was mentioning, not all discrimination is obvious, therefore not all programs are going to be effective. And what's really important to know is that when alone, an isolated component like training is often divisive, and coaching can be expensive and unpredictable and doesn't always really target. In fact, it rarely, without a targeted approach, addresses the very subtle acts of exclusion that it needs to address. Awareness and awareness building activity fails to inspire diversity appreciation, and diversity policies are sometimes seen as disruptive or even an attempt to create some kind of unfair advantage, when in fact it is simply an attempt to create an equitable and fair solution. So what we know is that resistance is predictable, and we're going to have to create a structure to approach this resistance, which leads us to a tipping point, right? We know that our social complexity right now, social injustice, systemic and structural discrimination, and polarized views, and microaggressions, and subtle acts of exclusion, and overt acts of exclusion, and social identity insecurity, and a long overdue change in the tides, combined with social media and what's being called our call-out culture, is resulting in a bit of an organizational crisis. I take that back. It's not a bit of an organizational crisis. In many situations, it has become an organizational crisis. So we, as the leaders in change around diversity and inclusion, and we're the ones responsible for the results, right? We must design our programs in such a manner as to prepare for division and mitigate the risks, which is why we want to share with you something right away to take away, and that is how to extinguish the fuse of resistance. There's been a lot of research around social identity, and knowing that there will be resistance, and designing our programs to be effective will in fact minimize the threat to one's social identity, which is what causes the majority of resistance. You know, social identity theory, you may have heard about it, was popularized in 1986, research by Teifel and Turner, in fact. They proposed that groups, which people belong to, were an important source of pride and self-esteem. And so as such, when those groups, their social identity threatened, when others were accusing them of immoral behavior, there's this automatic response to, I must protect myself. Well, that's what we're seeing now in the workplace. And so in order for effective programs to begin being more effective, we've got to soften the resistance out of the gate. Now, that does not diminish the fact or the truth that we must also address historical injustices. But the focus, in order to build a bridge, has to be on progress made, on the value of diversity. And if we talk about the value of diversity in business, we can talk about the fact that numerous research shows that organizations that foster a diverse workplace and are committed to this can outperform their competitors by as much as 38%. This is a really big deal. We want to bring forth the concepts around, we're going to focus on what exactly are the behaviors that represent our organizational values of inclusion versus the behaviors that represent exclusion. We're going to look to eliminate public shaming. We're going to look to focus more on the benefits of equality for all and to creating a safe place for education and growth. And we're going to find ways to listen more intensely. which brings us to the elephant in the room that all of this is talking about, which is a dominant focus on historical injustices will cause those majority groups to feel threatened, remember that social identity, and they will resist, deny, and withdraw support for DEI goals. Some of them will do it overtly, most will do it subconsciously and not so overt. But what we know is that when that happens, our minority groups begin to feel even more marginalized, even more frustrated, and frankly exhausted, and who can blame them, right? What we know is DEI defensiveness is real, and it will derail programs. So what do we do about that? Our approach, and what I want you to make sure you take away, like I said earlier, we're going to share this lean, continuous cultural transformation conversation as an end-to-end solution to build an inclusive workplace, to enable that diverse hiring and team building and decision making at all levels of your organization. But this is a framework. And even though we're going to introduce some technologies and some methodologies that will make it more turnkey for you, more systematic for you, the bottom line takeaway is that to overcome the structural flaws that we've talked about that most DEI programs will face and to mitigate resistance, you're going to have to help your team deliver the right sized approach at the right time with the right people to ensure that measurable ROI that Swetha was talking about earlier and ensure long-term success. And there's three very important components: identify, engage, and solve. So this is a continuous cultural transformation. It is an iterative process. The first point being identify. Organizational network analysis identifies unconscious biases, the employees who are impacted, the people leaders who are already champions of this, your individual contributors who are passionate and eager about it. The second step is about engaging. If you had an individual who could do nothing but knock on doors and listen to employees and take it to heart, fantastic. But if not, which most of us don't have that kind of resource, we're going to introduce you in a moment to Kim, our empathetic AI chatbot that is always available resource for your employees to voice their needs. Kim intelligently, and you're going to be so excited when you see this, deep dives into actionable issues and escalates them to people leaders. Finally, step 3 is all about solving. And it's about giving people leaders access to expert D&I consultants for education, training, coaching, mentoring, mediation, DEI consulting, and enabling them to take the right actions at the right time and to make the right decisions. So it's got to be scalable, it's got to be targeted, and it's got to be just in time.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Anissa. So one of the first steps that we have developed, and what we also want you guys to think about as you're thinking about how to really make those shifts so that you can turn your ship in the right direction, it's to identify the right people within the organizations who can actually affect change, but also identify the programs that are necessary and who it's necessary for. So the first step is to look at, okay, how do I understand my team? How do I look at my team? Org chart that you see on the left, that's exactly how a lot of companies, this is so familiar, that's how we look at our organization. That's what decision rights look like. We use it to drive accountability, responsibility, etc. But this org chart, as useful as it is, it doesn't really show all the complex relationships formed, all those connections, those bonds that are formed by just operating as a team together. And what research has shown us is that it's actually, while you have this kind of formal structure that is almost the skeleton of your team, the nervous system of your team are these connections and these bonds. And when your company is stressed, or when your team is stressed, like in order to incorporate a new member from a diverse community into the team, or high stress environment, because that's just the environment, that's just the industry that we have, it's these connections and networks that flex and give your organization that room and that ability to address those stressors and actually respond. But these relationships are very hard to see. Most managers can maybe see one or two, maybe a few of them, they'll know, but you won't know all of the relationships and the bonds. So how do you actually get visibility into that? There are multiple companies that you could potentially use, but a lot of them are not as turnkey. What we have is what we've developed is a organizational network analysis that allows you to very quickly, easily get that visibility into the hidden relationship. But the key here is, regardless of using this or some other visualization tool, which looks at all the network data, I would encourage you guys to do is to really get visibility into those hidden relationships, because it does really two key things. And it identifies those at-risk employees, so you can actually say, hey, I've hired a lot of women into my team, I'm doing great. But what happens if they're on the periphery? So they don't feel like they're involved. They're not socially involved. They're maybe not involved within the mentorship network. What happens then? So we can actually give you that visibility. And then on top of that, we can also identify those key employees who is already playing that role of inclusionary leader. And what you see on the left-hand side right now is a demo of what our tool really looks like. So our tool, if you were to use it, is a completely web-based tool that looks at the network. What this is just how instead of that org chart, it's that relationship map. Each circle is a person. Each line are those relationships that they have. And the bigger the circle, the more influential they are. So you see that red circle right there, that person is actually a hub and a broker, because they can connect a lot of different disparate groups together. And you can see all the disparate groups very fast. You can actually say, okay, who is that person? What is their racial identity? Where are they located? We can cut and dice this data in different ways so that we can give you that visibility into the tool, into your relationships and those connections. So that's really one of the big steps that we would provide as part of the Lean DEI identify aspect of the framework.
All of those dots that we were just looking at, what you're sharing with us is that I can identify, okay, who are my at-risk employees? Who are those who are passionate about this but feel marginalized? And who might my influencers and champions of change as an individual contributor or a people manager or etc. That's what you're sharing with us, right?
Exactly, Anita. So, and one of the things that you'll also see are those people, are those dots that aren't connected. So that's where a lot of the marginalized people are. And the interesting thing is the way that we've built this, we don't actually just look at just connections just broadly. We actually can dive in and say, what type of connections? Are these social connections, or are they mentorship connections? Or are they perhaps sponsorship, ideas, validation type of connections? So we can actually say, hey, you know what? Here are the people, employees are doing great socially. They have a lot of trust networks built with all the rest of the team, but they're on the outside, they're on the periphery of your knowledge network. So they don't actually get the information fast. So they can't be part of all the team building and innovative ideas generation. So we can actually see that level of detail in the way that we've organized this. And that gives us also the ability to deep dive at different levels within the organization. And we can roll that up and say, okay, here's where it's broken at the team level. But here at the department level, you need to focus on mentorship and sponsorship maybe. But socially, your teams are disparate. So we can kind of go broad, but we can also go deep. But the key thing that we identify are the people. Who are the people who are impacted? And how are they being impacted? So the biases that are present, is it mentorship that is lacking? Is it social biases? Whatever they are, we can identify those. And then most importantly, what we identify are those influencers, those people leaders who are best positioned to actually drive change because they are already in that position. They're already there. We just need to amplify them. So that's really what that identify really provides. Once we know that, now we need to engage with teams at scale. So let me turn that over to Vivek, and we'll learn more about engagement.
Thanks, Rita. Engaging with our employees essentially means communicating with them, having conversations to understand the issues that they're facing, and more importantly, taking the steps and actions that will resolve those issues. But for those of us that are at small organizations, it's very easy to conceptualize how do we sit down and have that conversation between every employee and every leader. For those of us that are at larger organizations with more distributed workforces, how do we have that conversation at scale? And how do we have that conversation continuously and on demand? For those of us in organizations like that, I want you to meet Kim. Kim is an always available chatbot that has organic conversation with employees to understand their needs. She lives on your messaging channel, and chatting with her feels like DMing with a coworker. She's got this very interesting combination of anonymity plus empathy, which creates the perfect space for very candid feedback. And that's because employees feel that they're not being judged, that they can talk transparently and openly with confidence. So there's two ways that an employee can chat with Kim. And whether or not you're using a tool like ours, we recommend that you have these communication pipelines. The first is whenever an employee wants to escalate a critical issue, Kim is available at any time to directly take that feedback to leadership. More commonly, when leaders want to understand employee thoughts on particular topic areas, Kim will reach out and have those conversations. For those of you that are in organizations where it's possible to sit down and have these conversations with every employee, we certainly encourage you to do that. For those of you at larger sized organizations, Kim can help you have these conversations at scale. But the question really becomes, how do we know which of these conversations to be having, which employees, and at what time? And that's where the network analysis comes in. Network analysis tells us which employees should be having which conversations. For example, if I know that members of my minority group X are sitting on the periphery, they're not connected to key decision makers or to strong mentors, I know that's an area I need to dive in on. And Kim will engage with those employees, understanding their on-the-ground reality, what are their immediate needs, and how to address them. Now, to preface, the conversations that we recommend that you have are not reactive. We're not asking outright, hey, are you facing discrimination? Instead, what we want to do is focus on the underlying issues, and we focus on resolving those issues before they escalate into very public incidents. So I actually want to take a moment here to show you what a conversation with Kim looks like. So this is an example of an employee that has chatted with Kim a couple of times in the past. They know who she is, why they should chat with her, what's going to happen with their data, et cetera. Now Kim has reached back out to me to talk about my project that just ended last week. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this conversation. And Kim is asking me, do I feel like I had influence over the decisions made during the project? I'm going to say, not really. I felt like a lot of my ideas were ignored. And Kim is doing this kind of deep dive because we know this employee was likely to maybe not have a big say in decision making. Kim is using a couple forms of natural language processing, and she wants to dive in and understand more here. She wants to know if this is a trend that's occurring at my company as a whole. So I'm going to say something like, yeah, I feel like some of us constantly need to prove ourselves, and some have it really easy. Of course, any of my misspellings and stuff get fixed up by Kim in the back end. But she's also going to use some emotional analysis to empathize with me here, let me know that this is an area that the organization is focusing on and that my thoughts are going to be passed along anonymously. Next, she wants to check in if my project manager or if anyone else is showing interest in my career progression. So I'm going to say kinda, but he's not often available. This is an area where we can integrate with your existing initiatives, with your existing programs. In this case, this company already has a mentorship program that the employee may not have been available about. And when we recognize in real time the issue that they're facing, we can direct them over to that resource immediately. The last thing that I want to demo here is one of the really useful features of having a chat-based interface, which is understanding when you don't want a chatbot to be handling a scenario. For example, If I was to say something like, there have been several instances of harassment, serious issues like this are immediately able to flag. We can put them up into escalation flows so that a human can take over immediately. So this is just a very quick example of a demo conversation. Usually there'll be a couple more questions, but it typically never takes more than 2 minutes of an employee's time.
So Vivek, on this point right here, one of the things that you were just showing too, that the employee is specifically asked if they want to share that input anonymously or if they can share their name. That's really important, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. The two things that we found are very important in building an effective feedback process are not only anonymity, but transparency. So employees should know when exactly what they're saying is anonymous and when it's not. They should also know who exactly is going to be on the other end that's going to be able to read that data. And what I didn't show you in this demo, what we often see employees do with Kim is they'll ask, who can see this? What's happening with my data? And Kim can understand that and tell you who's on the other end.
Beautiful.
Once we go through these conversations, what we do is surface that into emotional insights, topic analysis. We'll extract out the most important issues. But the key thing to remember, not just for our program, but for any process that is metrics driven, is that the analytics alone don't equate to improvement. Just dumping data on already busy leaders is ultimately counterproductive, and we need to be giving a clear path towards improvement. And that path starts with having conversations with employees to uncover their hidden issues. We're then responsive to those issues by broadcasting back saying, hey, we heard what you're saying and this is what we're doing about it. Or we heard what you're saying and we need help in order to figure out what to do about it. That's where crowdsourcing comes in. Engage your employees in the solution building process and get solutions from them that you know are going to be effective. Finally, continue to check in over periods of time. This is not a one and done process. The conversation continues and you ensure that the needle is incrementally but constantly moving. Now, this is a process that Kim carries out all of these steps in our solution, but whether you use our solution or not, the process, the principles is something that we advise any company to do. At the end of the day, this process, this path should show to employees that if I engage in the feedback process, my issues are going to be resolved in a timely manner. And if as a people leader, I'm engaging the process, I should feel that the next step is always clear. I never have to ask, what do I do next when going from identification of an employee need all the way into resolving it and communicating that resolution. At the end of the day, what this means is that we have talked to the employees that are impacted by D&I issues about those biases that they're facing, and we've delivered those insights to the people leaders that are best positioned to drive change for that specific group of employees. But I know what some of you are thinking. We have this process now, but how do we make sure that those leaders are actually going to make the right decisions and that they're going to take the right actions? I'm going to pass it over to Anissa for that.
Thank you, Vivek. That was very helpful. So now we're at the solve stage, right? But as we talked about earlier, not all DEI solutions are effective for all people, right? So let's just go high level for a moment and talk about the elements of a comprehensive DEI program. First, you know you're going to want to develop a mentoring program focused on diversity, right? You're also going to want to make sure you pay close attention to the need for top-down sponsorship and diverseness across age, sexual orientation, race, religion, gender, and other various identities. Number two, you're going to want to establish and reevaluate annually your diversity-focused recruiting plan, including the use of hiring technology to increase fairness. Number three, you're going to want to facilitate awareness and buy-in via unconscious bias, anti-racism and inclusion training, and of course, multicultural competence training. Number four, we want you to support and fine-tune your discrimination, anti-harassment policies. Very important to review those on a pretty regular basis. Number five, you want to inspect and improve your complaint systems, particularly as Kim shared in that escalation process, making sure that your folks know how to escalate an issue. Number six, you're going to want to foster diversified business networks and cross-company networking by establishing employee resource groups, right? And then number 7, if you don't already, make sure that you've got a diversity and inclusivity manager, as well as internally recruiting your special teams, your champions of change through that identification process we mentioned as step 1. Number 8 is all about creating a safe space for conversations about race and diversity. And here's the kicker. We're not going to get this right. We're going to be imperfect about it. There's going to be resistance. There's going to be hurt feelings. We're going to get this wrong. But if your leaders can buy into a little humility and setting the culture right on the path forward, we understand we're not going to get this right or perfect out of the gate, but we are committed to the values of cultivating a respectful and inclusive culture, then that's going to be a lot more tolerant of the difficulty of navigating these waters. Finally, you're going to want to inspire that culture change via top-down support and executive sponsorship of diversity resolutions and inclusion values. Someone in our chat box earlier says, well, what happens when we have constant turnover of leaders? That is one of the reasons why your champions of change, which will turn over less, are so critical to an effective DEI program. And finally, it's really about committing to continuous improvement through identify, engage, and solve. So let's look a little bit at the specific micro consulting and coaching and training and facilitated discussion circles and train the trainer, especially for your champions of change teams, is so important. Building out a mentoring program. You know, these programs, we know it's not one size fits all. And the check the box approaches don't work, right? So let's tie all this together, because it's not about having all these programs for everybody, but it is about, once you've identified who your champions are, who your at-risk employees are, who the leaders who are already bought into passionately to creating change, now you want to make sure they have the knowledge, the skills, what they need to know about subtle acts of exclusion or microaggressions, so that they can begin cultivating the confidence to speak up and hold up the values of your organization of respect. So let's look at this iterative process here, the framework we've talked about for lean DEI.
So as Anissa was saying, the process and the cadence that we follow is very much about creating those iterative cycles. So every 6 months, we've got a identify stage, which is when we're running a network analysis that's going to inform the rest of the steps in the process. Then in between those identifications, we are continuously engaging with employees. We're having that continuous conversation that's understanding issues and needs, that's providing the pipeline in order to get those issues resolved. And then when necessary, our DEI experts can be brought in to help those leaders be effective. The other thing that's happening underlying this entire process is that our experts are monitoring the entire flow. And when it's necessary, they'll reach out with the right size solution at the right time, which might mean that there is a certain group or a certain leader that needs micro consulting. Another might need coaching. Maybe there's another group that needs training or help in their change management. It's all focused to what that specific employee or what that specific leader needs at that time. So what this means is that now we have listened to employees that are most impacted by D&I issues. We have increased awareness on the biases that are present in the organization. And we've targeted development for people leaders. We've enabled them to take the right actions and to make the right decisions. And in fact, if we go back to our original case study, how much more cultural change could have occurred sooner if Starbucks, for example, had the technology and framework for responding proactively and with persistence with targeted solutions to their cultural norms rather than a more reactive approach. I just want to quickly mention that we've been working in this space for a very long time with clients of many different sizes in all different industries. Our collective experience includes decades of working with companies in all sectors: public, private, government, education, for-profits, nonprofits, across all industries. Now, to just quickly recap, Lean DEI is a framework that's built on network analysis, AI, and coaching. The three major steps are identifying, engaging, and solving. And what's important for you to take away is that it is a iterative and continuous process. I'm not going to go into this too deeply, but the goals of the solution is that you really take a holistic strategy towards D&I rather than viewing it as a one-off initiative, where of course we're looking at continuous improvement, where people are the key and the focus of the program, where we have customized and targeted the solutions to be the right-sized approach, where we're focusing on your on-the-ground leaders, your internal champions that can really drive the change. We're creating clear ROI so that you can continue to get internal buy-in. And all of this is driving towards a long-term impact.
Yeah, I mean, this is that incremental step so that you're not swerving. You're actually working, building on all the things that you are already doing well, fixing the gaps in the exact areas that you don't have good programs in place for, so that it becomes a holistic approach, and it becomes a true strategy, not just a initiative, not just a program, and it's not just about employees. It transcends every level and every organization and function within your company.
That's exactly right. We'd love to field a couple of questions. If we don't get to your questions today, please feel free to email us, reach out directly at consult@leandei.com. We know that Lean DEI is not the right solution for every company, but we hope that the framework that we've shared with you today, identify, engage, solve, and the underlying principles of continuous cultural improvement, right-sized solutions will be considered as you evaluate how to address your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Now, if you heard something today that makes you curious to see if this is a good fit for your company, you can pick up the phone and give us a call, or you can visit us online at leandei.com. You'll see a button there to join our waitlist and actually schedule a free consultation session.
Yeah, and I know on the chat, a lot of people have asked about copies of the deck. We will definitely be sending that out, as well as a videotape recording of this webinar, so you have all of that information to take away, specifically some of those really text-heavy slides that I know people were requesting. So we can do that. I know that there was one question in the chat around microaggressions and how we actually define it and what we mean by it. So one of the things that, this goes back to our program, especially for the solve portion, really addresses this because of those overt or those covert behaviors that Anisa mentioned way back in the beginning about DEI defensiveness. So these microaggressions are often a way for companies or for employees to show covertly a way to kind of not really resist, or to actually resist a lot of the change. So that's what we mean by that. And, we can always go into this more, William, if you have more questions. So happy to discuss more. And then also, again, what kind of, we'll take on any other questions that we see here. Sheila, I know you've been addressing a lot of them. Do you mind sharing all the questions?
Absolutely. So we have had a pretty active chat box today, and I thank you all so much for that. I know how near and dear this subject is to everyone. And we do have some unanswered questions in the question and answer section. One of those was, the microaggressions, and, expanding on this term. I think that's important too. Can you guys go further into what is a microaggression and perhaps some examples?
Yeah, so let me actually, since I said it, let me turn it over to Vivek, and then we can take it from there, and we can always talk a little bit more if we need to beyond that.
Yep. So microaggression, I mean, the definition of it is it's for kind of commonplace your verbal or behavioral actions, intentional or unintentional, that are kind of creating a hostile or negative or derogatory attitude towards your more marginalized groups. What constitutes as a microaggression can really depend on what the culture of your workplace is. Sometimes It's as simple as just being automatically dismissive of ideas that come from a certain group. Sometimes it could be more about the social clubs that form within the organization. The important thing, I think, is more that we take an overall look at our behavior through the lens of cultural change rather than trying to lose our minds assessing every single action that we take throughout the day. A part of our process is that you're making continuous and underlying change, and then automatically your surface behaviors are going to change as well.
Yeah, it goes back to that diffusing that bomb of self-identity to the social identity. So if we can diffuse that, we can make sure that these behaviors are not they don't come up within the cultural context of the company itself.
Yep. I see a question here. My team and I are stuck in our D&I journey. How do we know what problems are within our department? How do we change when we are unsure what needs to be changed? That's a great question. That's really kind of where identifying and engaging comes in. So broadly speaking, what we recommend is first understand the connections and relationships within your department and your team. Once you have that understanding, then you know what are the areas that you actually need to start diving into. You at least have an understanding of the relationships and how those would result in problems. Then the most important piece is that you are actually having conversations with everyone within that department. And from there, assessing what is the sentiment around particular areas. And after that, when you're unsure of what needs to be changed, really, we just recommend ask the people on the ground.
And we have another question here that says, how can you help structure surveys as one of the first steps to get the analysis going? And we're happy to do that as far as the surveys. I mean, that's part of our offering in our framework so that we can get that whole entire process going. I mean, the surveys tend to be our way of understanding what's happening on the ground. And also, as Vivek was mentioning, engaging and broadcasting. So we actually create surveys in much more, it ends up being a very two-way street, the way that we structure our surveys and our data gathering. But we're happy to talk more about it. If you just go onto the website, and there's a calendar link right there to book an appointment with us. So we're happy to talk more about how this can actually be useful for your company or any of your subsidiary portfolio companies.
The other point that I'll make is that we are fairly custom in the way that surveys are structured, because we're going from a organizational analysis stage into very custom conversations with individual employees. What we found to be most important is if you're asking very generic questions that don't matter to the on-the-ground reality of an employee, you're not going to get the engagement you need. You're not going to get the kind of data that you need, and it's not going to become actionable. It's going to become a metric that just sits there and does nothing. So a very important piece is that you're writing your specific questions to be about that employee's reality. And it's more about a deep dive on how do we get from a problem area into an actionable issue, rather than just a general pulse that's trying to figure out what's going on in the first place.
Absolutely. And this actually dovetails right into the next question we have, which is, this is where my team is stuck within our D&I journey. How do we know what the problems are within our department? How do we start change when we're unsure what needs to be changed? A wonderful question. That's exactly the dilemma that we hear a lot from a lot of companies and from a lot of our clients. And that's why it's so important to do that: identify, then engage, and then solve. So that's why we've come up with this framework, so that you know where you are and you can actually leverage your existing programs. Because a lot of companies, let's face it, D&I has been a focus for so many, multiple decades at this point. So there are a lot of programs in a lot of companies, a lot of policies and ways of escalation. All of those are set up, but it may not be comprehensive. It may not be addressing the right issue. Maybe it's targeted in the wrong way. Maybe people just don't know about it. Those are the things that our deep dive analysis really brings up to the foreground. And then we can address that and customize whatever solution is, whatever the next steps are, to exactly what you need.
So I'm just scrolling up through the chat here. So I see a question for you. How do you account for people that are not telling the whole truth about the relationships in the network?
Yeah, we have a few different mechanisms that we actually use to make sure that we're looking at the network correctly. And to eliminate a lot of the biases. Anytime you're going out and collecting data from an employee, there's going to be some bias. The thing about network analysis and the way that we do it, which is not just using a survey, but we also then look at things like your passive data that you may have. Sometimes it's chatbots, sometimes it's your email logs. If we're allowed, we can pull all of that in and basically triangulate and make sure that you're not just saying that I have a strong social relationship with someone that I may never even share an email with, which kind of sometimes isn't correct, but maybe they sit right next to each other. So maybe that is valid. But we can actually triangulate all of that by looking at your passive data, looking at just what, information about you within the company. We can also start to look at other types of data that you may have already. And then we look at our surveys, our pulse surveys, and how that information comes in. And one of the key things that we also do is that we only look at the strong connections. So we're not that interested, or we don't really capture the data on just someone that you have coffee with once in 6 months, because they're unlikely to actually have an impact on you and your biases. So we actually only look at your strong connections because that has the biggest impact on how you feel within the company. So there are multiple different mechanisms. I'm happy to chat more about this. If you guys need to understand this further, we can definitely deep dive into that.
I see a question from Denise. What's your best suggestion on keeping diversity and inclusion non-political? So this kind of goes into the point that Anissa was bringing up at the top, which is too much focus on historical injustices is going to backfire, because you're going to cause your majority groups to withdraw, your minority groups to just get exhausted. We find that overly political approaches to D&I tend to be the more reactive ones. Instead, what we suggest is that you focus on the underlying issues before they evolve into more public kinds of incidents. That means things like making sure that every employee's voice is heard, making sure that people have access to the right mentorship and sponsorship, that they're involved in the right knowledge networks, that you've created the right resource groups for them. And when you are focusing more on those cultural changes that are about inclusion, rather than focusing on larger systemic forces, not to say that you shouldn't acknowledge that they exist, we find that to be much more effective, not only in keeping people engaged in those programs, but also in making your actions feel more authentic and genuine, because you're focusing on the things that you can actually improve that relate to employees' reality.
Vivek, we had a question much earlier from Kim about Kim, and she asked, do the escalated comments get reported anonymously?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is the employee's choice. So when we recognize a escalation type issue that's very critical, we'll ask the employee saying something like, hey, this sounds like something that needs to be handled by someone in person. Is it okay if I share with them your contact information so they can directly reach out to you? If an employee chooses to remain anonymous and they don't want to reveal their contact information at that time, we will still escalate upwards some sort of demographic or organizational information, so you know, like what department or what office location that you can start a process in. But a huge piece of keeping faith in the feedback process is in being always open about who is going to be able to see what and being transparent.
And we have just about a minute left. I would encourage you, if you have any other questions you'd like to ask, we'd be happy to address those. And if we can't, then please do reach out to us. You'll see, I'll go ahead and put it into the chat again. You can reach out and schedule a moment to speak at your convenience by utilizing our online calendar, or you can call us at 281-845-8255. 8800. And we would be happy to meet with you one-on-one and just serve as a brainstorming partner for you, discuss what your organization needs and how we can best customize something to be, a great fit for your culture and your budget.
Exactly. I mean, the key thing that, after being in this space for so long, one thing that I've realized is that there is no silver bullet. There is no one size fits all type solution. So what we're really interested in and what I'm really excited to hear more about are each of the challenges. And like Sheila said, those brainstorming sessions, because we recognize that everybody is at different points along the journey that Anissa went through of what constitutes a comprehensive DEI program. You guys probably have a few of them, but not all of them. We want to know more so that we can actually say, okay, here's how you can use this Lean DEI framework for you. And I know that there was one question, but I think that's something that Kim, Barry, if you don't mind just contacting us, we'll set up a time and we're happy to talk more about how we can facilitate and support more open communication. You're absolutely right. Anonymous can only be so powerful. You actually have to have the more courageous conversations that will actually drive change in order to drive change. So we can talk about how we can help you along that.
Our Kim has a lot to say on that topic.
I'm sure. Well, thank you, everybody. And we hope to hear from you soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.